So today, our overall objective for this presentation is that you will all be able to describe a process for developing an evidence-based practice, quality improvement, or research proposal based on your own area of interest and then also the needs in the area where you're currently working. So first, I'd just like to define these different inquiry types so we're all starting out with the same foundational understanding. So we're defining evidence-based practice as a problem-solving approach that pulls research evidence and best practices together to address a clinical issue. And we're defining quality improvement as the implementation of systematic and data-guided processes that target a specific area of clinical care in need of improvement. And lastly, research, we're defining as investigation used to find answers and draw conclusions regarding topics that we might have current limited information about or not sufficient nursing knowledge about. So today's presentation should help you develop a proposal for any of those project types. So there's some polling available also on the resource panel. Our first polling question is, which types of inquiries have you conducted before? If you'd like to go ahead and take that poll on the panel, and I'm just going to watch as the polling comes in. It looks like we have quite a few of you that have a lot of experience in evidence-based practice, QI, and many haven't done anything yet. And then some research experience as well. So a pretty diverse group with a little bit of everything. So before we dive in, we'd like to get a sense of your current experience. So we'll continue to be doing these polls as we move through. And then I wanted to draw your attention to this diagram here. We have the different inquiry types depicted, and there's this arrow along the bottom. So the arrow along the bottom is just to signify that although we're identifying them as different inquiry types, they do tend to bleed together, or one of the types might lead into the other type. Oh, let's see. I think this is the poll that we just did. I tried. Let's see. Okay. So when we think of developing a project, this is the diagram that we think of that we came up with to kind of help describe the process. We're very visual people, Penny and I. We like to start by thinking of the interests that we have. So something that really excites you in your current clinic setting and your ambulatory care setting that leads you to think of a lot of different questions about it. Perhaps a process that you could make better, perhaps a clinical issue that you wish you had information about. But it's really important to start any sort of project with your overall interests, acknowledging that sometimes you're provided with a mandate by a supervisor or an administrator and told that you're going to work on a certain type of project. Maybe you don't have a lot of initial interest in. But I would encourage you, regardless of whether it's a mandate or something you're intrinsically motivated to do, to find an aspect of that that really excites you, that's going to keep you going throughout the entire project process. Because oftentimes projects can take anywhere from weeks to months, sometimes even years, or maybe even longer than that. So you want to be able to feel like it's a really worthwhile endeavor and less like it's a chore that you just have to complete. So next, I'd like to focus in on developing a question or a purpose. The question and the purpose derive directly from your area of interest. Your area of interest can be broad or it can be narrow. The question and the purpose will help to hone it down even further. So to kind of illustrate this, I'll draw from some examples from my areas of interest. So as a forensic nurse and sexual assault nurse examiner, one of the things that's really interesting to me is the childhood trauma experienced by adult sexual assault survivors. If I'm thinking of developing a question that hones in on that particular area of interest, I might actually develop 10 questions and then select the one that best represents my area of interest that I want to focus in on. So I'll give you some examples. One question I might develop is, how do sexual assault survivors describe their experiences of childhood trauma? Another question I might develop is, are there ways to screen sexual assault survivors for childhood trauma? The question is going to be linked to the purpose. You can think of the purpose as a statement, turning the question into a statement. In some cases, you might actually start with the purpose. If your administrator says, you must do X, Y, Z, you can turn that into a purpose statement and develop your research question from the purpose. As academics, I think we tend to work in the reverse and develop the question first and then the purpose. But let me give you an example of what the purpose would look like. So for my question of how do sexual assault survivors describe their experiences of childhood trauma, my purpose says to describe the experience of childhood trauma among sexual assault survivors. So they're congruent and they fit together. One's a question, one's a statement. And it seems so basic, but at the same time it's so crucial, because sometimes if we're working from a question and trying to derive a purpose, we can subtract things from our initial question or add things into the purpose that don't quite belong. And it can really make it difficult to determine if we're going to do an evidence-based practice, a QI, or a research project, and really muddy our goals as we go through. So those two things need to be congruent before you proceed. And your inquiry type is derived directly from there. So going back to our first example question, how do sexual assault survivors describe their experience of childhood trauma? So you look at your questions that you develop and you think, what am I really asking here? So in this particular context, I'm asking about something that we might not have a lot of knowledge of currently. And I'm asking in such a way that I'm asking about a description, a qualitative description in particular. So I could easily turn this into a qualitative question and do a research study. For my other question, which was, are there ways to screen sexual assault survivors for childhood trauma? I'm really asking about what other people have done. What has worked, what hasn't worked, what information can I pull from, what can I view to see these different screening procedures. So this is an evidence-based practice style question, not the same as a PCOT question, so we'll get to that a bit later. This is just your initial question that gets you going. So with this question, you're moving in the EBP direction. But say I had a different kind of question. Maybe how could I implement a screening tool that would allow me to identify past childhood trauma and enhance community referrals that we're currently making? So I'm looking at a process that's currently established and I'm trying to determine how I can improve that process. So that would be a QI type question. So looking back at the purpose, or looking back at the interests that you have, try to develop, maybe take some notes on either a question or a purpose or both that directly relate to your interests that you've identified. And if you'd like to share that in the poll, you can feel free to do that. So a few questions here, and then some statements that you can easily switch over into a purpose, like the statement, lived experience of caregivers. So I'm guessing that's an interest statement. So you could switch it up however you'd like. For example, you could say something about to describe the lived experience of caregivers. Workplace violence. What factors impact workplace violence in a particular setting? So think of your interests and ask a question about it or make a statement about it. And there's a spot for you on the worksheet to jot notes down related to this as well. So we wanted to acknowledge that although we're talking about these as distinct things, as I mentioned, there's an arrow down there, and sometimes the lines can get just a little bit blurred. So it's important to understand if you're getting into a particular inquiry that you might actually end up doing something else and have a sense of that before you get started. So again, pulling from an area of interest of mine is sexual assault nurse examiner certification processes. So say I were to start out to conduct an evidence-based practice project focused on this. I might do a literature review to see what factors encourage sexual assault nurse examiners to become certified and what factors discourage them. What if in my EBP project I found almost nothing? Very few articles, very little information from rape crisis centers, then what would I do? I might have to consider transitioning into a research project